In 1926, the last wolf pack in Yellowstone National Park was eradicated. And in 1994, an environmental impact statement for wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone and central Idaho was completed. It received more than 160,000 public comments. At the time, that was the most comments a federal proposal had ever received. Wolves were reintroduced the following year, but that stat itself is telling. People have opinions about wolves.
It was unfortunate that more of us did not think harder about the potential for the backlash.
From a wildlife standpoint, wolves are a smashing success. From a social experiment standpoint, the wolf reintroduction has been a disaster of the greatest degree, and we're going to pay for that in years to come.
In the West, bounties are being paid for dead wolves.
We were told that the reintroduction would contain the wolves to central Idaho wilderness. Somehow the wolves did not get that memo.
New laws in Montana allow them to be hunted at night, baited, and snared.
It comes after the Montana legislature tasked the commission with taking new steps to reduce the wolf population.
Not all hunters agree with these measures, but it is clear that the wild canines are reproducing, increasing their range, and redistributing big game populations. Meanwhile, the Department of the Interior is being pressured by environmental organizations to return gray wolves to the Endangered Species List. These organizations say the states just can't handle wolf management. I'm Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs, and today I'm talking to Hunting and Conservation Editor Andrew McKean, who's been reporting on the latest developments in the decades-old conflict over gray wolves in the lower 48. Andrew, wolves have been in the news a lot this last year, both in outdoor news and the mainstream media. Can you catch us up on why that's the case? What's happening with wolves in North America?
Sure. Well, we've got a lot of wolves. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service basically manages them in two big sort of meta populations. There's the Western Great Lakes, that's Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, where there's like 4,000 wolves as a minimum count. So a lot of wolves. Then there's the western population, and that's really the core areas around Yellowstone Park. So Montana, Idaho, Wyoming. And what's interesting about wolves is they are pretty actively leaving that core area and colonizing spots in Washington State, Oregon, California, and now there's a new pack in northern Colorado. So in that Rocky Mountain or western population, there are about an estimated 3,000 wolves. And one thing, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about numbers in this conversation, but numbers are super problematic. Both sides, the side that thinks we have too many wolves, inflates the numbers to make their case. The other side, the side that says we don't have nearly enough wolves, undercounts to make their case too. So the numbers I just threw out are basically minimum populations based on observation and then some sort of calculus about X percentage more.
So these two general populations, western wolves and Great Lakes wolves, have they been treated as a single entity under the Endangered Species Act or as two separate populations?
They've really been treated as two separate populations. So both were protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act, but in two different actions. And so the first one that actually came off the list was that western population of wolves. Part of it was based around wolves were actually brought from Canada to Yellowstone Park in the mid-1990s, and they were released under what was classified at that time as an experimental population.
The pack is back.
The wolves are coming, restoring a long-missing link to America's oldest national park.
So they weren't, native wolves that we somehow protected and then they thrive. We actually had to bring them in as seed stock to create this new population. And so because of that population has always just been a little bit flimsy in terms of its classification. But that was the first one to come off the list because these population benchmarks that were established when we created the experimental population had been wildly achieved. That other population, that Western Great Lakes population, actually just came off the Endangered Species List. And so hunting seasons in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota are really pretty new. So again, two different populations and kind of two different management strategies too.
It seems like that most recent delisting in the Great Lakes region and hunting seasons around it have gotten people pretty fired up. Why is that the case?
So let's take Wisconsin as kind of patient zero for this case. They did a pretty good job of establishing a state-managed hunting season, and they had quotas, harvest quotas that were going to be used to basically stop hunting when they were achieved. And remember, this is the first hunting season in a lot of years of having no hunting. So in some ways, the state wildlife managers that have this renewed authority since the management went from the feds to the states, there's a lot of guesswork involved in terms of how quickly those quotas might be met, whether they would be exceeded or not. And it was a good winter for wolf hunting in Wisconsin, apparently. There was a lot of snow, just enough snow to make snowmobilers get out, enough snow to make wolves super visible, and the state exceeded their harvest quota by almost 100 animals.
Wisconsin hunters exceeded the quota of 119 wolves set by the state's Department of Natural Resources. The season ended early on Wednesday, with Wisconsinites hunting or trapping 216 wolves.
How is it possible that Wisconsin hunters exceeded the quota by such a large number?
You know, it was just a perfect storm. I think, one, wolves hadn't been hunted, so they were vulnerable and maybe not as, cagey and elusive as they might be after several hunting seasons. The conditions were right for it. And keep in mind, exceeding the quota happened in 3 days. I mean, it was a firing line in areas where there were abundant wolves. And I think, too, you can also look at it as... I call it the new reservoir phenomenon. Here's a new hunting season. There were lots of people engaged in it. There was a lot of excitement around it and a lot of participation. And so because it was new, a lot of people looked at that trend as unsustainable. And so that fired up a lot of wolf advocates to say, wait a minute, states can't be trusted with managing these wolves. Look what they just did in Wisconsin. I think that's a little bit extreme. It's 1 year of hopefully many. And so my guess is over time, wildlife managers will use science to base next year's quota on the last year's quota, and it'll sort of self-regulate. But anyway, welcome to the crazy world of wolf management. Everything is extreme right now.
Yeah, tell me about that. What is happening with wolf management out west?
There's kind of a concurrent dynamic going on in the west where Idaho, which has something like 1,500 wolves by the minimum population, Idaho and Montana are kind of fellow travelers with this. They both greatly deregulated hunting. So both states still manage them as big game, as trophy animals, but in both states there's wildly liberal quotas. The trapping season is super liberal and long. Both allow nighttime hunting, and both allowed for what opponents are calling a bounty system, return to bounties. Basically, organizations are raising money to pay for wolf harvest. I'm throwing that into also the Great Lakes dynamic, and a lot of people are saying, whoa, all of these mechanisms are creating a climate that may create too much wolf harvest. We need to pump the brakes a little bit.
I see the train is coming through town right on schedule. So who are those people saying that we need to pump the brakes?
There's been a very interesting sort of concerted celebrity voice about all this, and I don't frankly pay that much attention to who's saying what. But I will tell you this, that the people who are orchestrating this are pretty smart, and they're using wolves. Remember we said before, wolves make people crazy? This group is really doing a masterful job at taking, kind of riding the emotion and using celebrities to sort of stoke the fire of this, to say, hey, let's have a national conversation about this. Look what we're doing to the poor wolf. The equal and opposite reaction to that is all of these people are saying, wait, we've got way too many wolves on the landscape. Look what they're doing to our elk and our deer populations. We need to kill more wolves, not fewer. So that's sort of the dynamic that you and I have parachuted into.
All like the celebrity-driven campaign, all these organizations, like what are they asking for? What do they want to see happen with wolves in the U.S.?
So there's two. One is it's just kind of an awareness campaign, and you and I have been around long enough to know that awareness campaigns have an end game. In the case of wolves, it is probably, though not always explicitly, the end game is let's return them to the Endangered Species List. Let's take management away from the states. Let's end hunting and trapping seasons. Let's protect the wolf. And I'll follow that up to say there's evidence that this is a strategy because 2 weeks ago, a group of 70 environmental groups petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to relist the wolf, basically to put him back under federal protection. And that was a move that had been anticipated pretty widely, but it surprised everybody that it happened this summer and kind of with the kind of intensity that it did. So you and I are talking 2 weeks into this. The Fish and Wildlife Service has, I think, 90 days to review that petition and then make a decision about it. Yes, we will consider relisting, or no, we don't think that populations have declined to the extent that relisting is necessary.
And if they do decide to move forward with looking at that listing, does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have the authority to just list a species under the ESA, or do they have to go through a certain protocol?
No, there's a process, and it's an interesting process. And in fact, in some ways, I think it helps protect the status quo. What they have to do is do a range-wide population analysis again, similar to what they did in 1974 when wolves were first listed as endangered species. And just based on what I was telling you a second ago with kind of the widely distributed wolves and pretty abundant populations in big segments of their range, I think it's unlikely that a listing decision would be made. But you got to look at kind of the political environment too. We've got a Democrat in the White House. The Interior Secretary has gone on record as saying that she thinks that grizzly bears should never be delisted. They're currently still under federal protection. And so there's a lot of concern that the kind of the political calculus and the players who are in positions right now to make a difference could play this trump card to say, actually, we don't think that wolves should be managed by the states. This is the trump card. Wolves pre-colonial, even in the midst of human settlement of the contiguous U.S., were everywhere. There were wolves in the Ohio Valley, there were wolves in the Southeast, there were wolves in the Northeast, there were wolves in the Great Lakes and Midwest, and obviously in the West. There are a lot of people who think that wolf recovery means that wolves occupy all of their original habitat, which would mean a lot of wolves, probably in every state. And clearly that's not happened. We don't have wolves in Ohio. We don't have wolves in Alabama or Missouri. And so wolf advocates would say that's a problem. We need to ensure that wolves can return to their historic range. Other people are saying, actually, we have vastly exceeded all the benchmarks for that original delisting. Wolves are doing fine. Let's manage them where they are. So those are kind of the two really ends of the poles. But that's kind of why this petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is potentially troublesome, because it could be the mechanism that allows for a much more expansive view of kind of wolf recovery.
So do the states have a wolf management problem? Like, is there any basis for these claims that, we're overhunting them, overtrapping them?
I could make the case on either side. So in the course of the story I've been doing, I've actually talked to some really interesting people, and I'll give you kind of two ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, I interviewed this guy named Justin Webb. He's the founder of an outfit called Foundation for Wildlife Management based in northern Idaho. And it's his group that's really been the engine for this sort of bounty program. They have big banquets and fundraisers to raise money to then pay people who are effectively hunting and trapping wolves.
The start of the foundation came from a close-knit, really hardcore, passionate group of elk hunters in North Idaho who were tired of seeing hamstrung moose while we were snowmobiling. We were tired of seeing groups of up to 20 elk that were killed and left. We were tired of seeing wolf tracks in every drainage and not being able to find elk anymore. Frustrated by all that, we finally got a wolf season. And we thought, by golly, here we are. We kill a nice bull every year. Every one of us, we're passionate, we're hardcore, we're the extremists that are in the backcountry all the time. We're going to go solve our problem. And we thought, when we got our wolf season, that we were going to go out and shoot the wolves that were causing the grief that we were experiencing, and we were going to knock their numbers down to a point to where they wouldn't be negatively impacting our elk hunts anymore. It wasn't that we hated wolves and didn't want them there. Wolves are amazing, and getting to hear a wolf howl from a ridgetop is pretty cool, but I also want to get to hear an elk bugle from a ridgetop in the backcountry. That's also important to me. So we headed out and we spent a ton of money, and we spent all season, rather than targeting elk and deer as we typically would, we spent that time targeting wolves, and we didn't kill a single wolf.
He would say the states are doing an abysmal job of managing wolves, that the hunting seasons are far too conservative, that we have too many sort of fair chase restrictions on hunting them. And if we really care about keeping wolves under control, we would adopt this bounty situation, and we would have year-round hunting. We would do everything we can to kill more wolves.
Pretty flabbergasted by that. We'd never run into something that we couldn't find success in targeting.
Yeah.
And couldn't understand it. We did a bunch of reading, talked to a bunch of guys from Alaska and Canada who said trapping is really the only successful method for controlling wolf numbers because wolves travel so far so quickly. It's difficult to find success just in hunting them, not on a scale that will control their numbers. So tracked down a couple of guys that trapped for a living. They trap marten and bobcat and sell the fur in the spring, and that's what they do through the winter months to feed their families. And we called them up, and one individual in particular, and we said, we're at our wits' end. We don't know what to do. We'd love to have you teach us how to trap wolves. And the guy says, I don't trap wolves. He said, you're obligated to trap wolves. He says, you don't get it. He said, I'm obligated to feed my family. I'm obligated to make house payments. He said, trapping wolves is going to cost you so much money, you won't be able to do it. So one of the guys says, well, I just spent $3,500 targeting wolves this year. I should have paid you that money and had you go trap wolves where I elk hunt. And they kind of laughed and chuckled about it. And one of the guys says, no, I'm serious. I'll pay you. What is it going to take? And that was kind of the basis of this conversation of what does it take monetarily to keep somebody who's productive at removing wolves in an area doing just that. And the guy said, well, for $500 a wolf, it'll at least be worth it for me to set wolf gear while I'm running my bobcat and marten lines in the wintertime. And the guys instantly started pulling money out of their pocket and putting it in a kitty, saying, we'll pay you. If you think you can get it done, we'll pay for it.
Other side of the spectrum, I talked to a guy named Nick Jivak, formerly worked for the Montana Wildlife Federation. He said, look, the states are doing a fine job of managing wolves. We have pretty consistent harvest of a couple of hundred animals every year in Montana.
I would argue that we had struck a really reasonable balance. Some people thought we were killing far too many, and other people thought we weren't killing nearly enough. And that tells me that we had a Goldilocks hunt. We had threaded the needle very well, and they threw that all out the window this last legislative session.
He said, we're fine. We are managing wolves exactly like we would other game species, and it's not only sustainable, but it's also politically palatable. Why that political palatability or sort of acceptability quotient is so meaningful? There's a clause in the Endangered Species Act that basically says the feds will look at the regulatory environment for states and decide whether that regulatory environment under state management is either benefiting or hurting the species. There are some people who say the bounty system, the unregulated hunting, that's pretty flimsy regulatory oversight by the states, and that might actually be a trigger to return the wolves to the endangered species list.
Montana and Idaho want to go to these measures like paying contractors to shoot them from the air and snaring. And, that harkens back to an eradication effort from, the 19th century. And, there is no other species where we manage for an absolute bare minimum number. They keep talking about the 150 wolves and 15 breeding pairs. That was never an objective. That was the point at which to begin the discussion of delisting. And that's the problem when you peg a number to any animal.
So it sounds a little bit like not just different state agencies, but different individuals are classifying wolves as either vermin or trophy game animals or animals that should never be hunted and just be preserved as they are. Is there a general consensus one way or the other, like where states are landing, or it's all just so up in the air while this relisting request is hitting?
No, it's actually pretty straightforward. So any state that wants to retain that management authority has to develop a pretty deeply and well-considered wolf management plan. So as part of that, they have to be classified as either big game animals, trophy animals, or fur bearers. And I'll get to the opposite of that in a second, but those legal classifications ensure that there's a season-setting process, that there's a public review process, that there's quotas and seasons, and so it's basically the scientific method of wildlife management being played out on behalf of the species. So that's sort of the responsible regulatory mechanism I was just talking about before. The other side of it is actually we have an example of that. Wyoming actually had a 2-tier management system when wolves were just coming off the list. So they had that they were declared as big game species in the counties outside of Yellowstone Park. But in the remainder of the state, they were classified as predators that could be shot on sight. And actually, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refused to delist wolves because Wyoming had this sort of 2-tier system. And they said, as long as you, Wyoming, consider them to be predators, we're not going to delist them. So that's a real regulatory sort of threat that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to wield. And I think it's pretty much ensured that most states keep them managed, at least on paper, as trophy animals. If I was litigating this, I might say, okay, states, we know you have classified these as trophy animals, but what are you really doing on the ground? So both Montana and Idaho, as I mentioned, have got kind of, it's a free-for-all when it comes to wolves. You can use night vision and thermal optics and hunt them at night. You can spotlight them. You can use snares, neck-choking snares. And so I think there's sort of a growing consensus and unease that might not pass the muster of appropriate regulatory mechanism. All of these, kind of runarounds around kind of the trophy management of wolves. I also interviewed Tony Schunan. He's the CEO of the Boone and Crockett Club, and he's got a really interesting perspective on that issue. I asked him, would wolves be considered trophy animals according to the big game records that the Boone and Crockett Club maintains? You might know about the Boone and Crockett Club. They also have a fair chase expectation of any animal that's entered in their record books. Now, there's no record book for wolves. They're not considered, a trophy species according to Boone and Crockett Club. But the club does require that they be hunted according to fair chase ethics. And Tony said night hunting, 12-month seasons, probably neck snaring, all of those things are not in the tradition of fair chase. And so the club would not consider that a legitimate harvest. And I throw that out there because I think that's sort of the middle ground that I certainly occupy, and I think a lot of our listeners occupy as well. Yeah, wolves are apex predators. They have this sort of outsized role in the landscape, but they're still wildlife. They're still a wildlife that we have obligations to hunt ethically and sustainably and, frankly, with a little bit of restraint. So we'll see what happens.
Are wolves so great or so terrible? Like, what is the impact that they're having or that folks are scared they're going to have or not have on the landscape? Like, why do we care about reintroducing wolves, and why are we spending so much time and energy and money fighting about it? Man,
that's actually a really good question. And I think it gets kind of at the thrust of this whole thing. So, again, this is the problem of being in the middle. I can kind of see both sides of it and somewhat articulate both of them. I mean, I'm a hunter who every year buys a wolf tag, so you kind of know where I stand on it. I want to keep hunting wolves, but I would say this, that the people who think we need to have more wolves in more areas legitimately recognize that wolves are what's called a keystone species. They are at the very head of so many ecosystem changes. Look what happened in Yellowstone Park as an example. Yellowstone Park had way too many elk because there was no predation on them. That overcarrying capacity or overabundance of elk changed so much of like the vegetation landscape in Yellowstone Park. So people who say we need to bring back wolves will point to that and say having an apex predator in an apex prey base changed both of them and the habitat that they occupy for the better. Wolves belong. They have this ecosystem role to play. And I can see that, and I can agree with that.
If you look at the history of wildlife depletion and restoration in our country, right, the hunters led the way in restoring wildlife in our country. And of course, the first thing they wanted to restore were deer and elk and popular game species. And the next element in the evolution of the hunter conservationist movement was restoring predators, grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions and species that had been purposely persecuted to drive their numbers down. And, that says a lot about our country. I mean, the only reason we can have wolves on the landscape is because we have abundant prey for them to eat. So I think hunters should take pride in having been at the forefront of restoring wolves. Now, that said, I think the vast majority of the hunting community says, yeah, wolves have a place on the landscape. They can help you get a healthier elk herd by, and they kill plenty of healthy animals too, but they still, when they get into a large herd of elk, they're going to try to pick out one that's just a little bit different, a little bit slower, the injured one, or the less robust one, the one that's older. And over time, you're going to get a better, healthier elk herd. I think the vast majority of hunters accept that wolves have a place on the landscape. And here's proof of that. We sell about 135,000 general elk licenses a year. And we sell over 200,000 deer licenses a year. And yet we sell about 17,000 wolf licenses. So the vast majority of hunters aren't even putting a $10 wolf license in their pocket, right? So that tells you that they don't really care. Now, of the 17,000, some of those are the fervent wolf haters who just think that we should drive them down to bare minimum numbers, or if they have their way, wipe them out. But I would suspect that the vast majority of them are just what you'd call incidental take. They're like, well, I'm an elk hunter, and I'll put a wolf tag in my pocket, and if the opportunity arises, I'll take a wolf. And we clearly see that in the wolf harvest numbers, right? Like the greatest wolf harvest is during our 5-week general deer and elk season.
On the other end of the spectrum, and Justin Webb is a really good source for this, there have been crazy and possibly permanent changes to big game patterns in much of Idaho and in a lot of Montana as well, where I've seen it just hunting elk in the mountains of Montana. Elk don't bugle as much as they used to. Their behavior has changed.
I absolutely do not have hatred for wolves like a lot of people believe. To the contrary, I believe that wolves are one of the most amazing animals that we have in the state of Idaho, and I have more respect for wolves after having pursued them for 10 years than any other animal that I've ever pursued.
In Idaho, Justin was talking about how state biologists count the same number of elk in hunting districts, but their distribution has changed entirely. They're no longer in the public land up in the mountains. They've all moved down to the river valleys where there's a lot of human presence and wolves don't feel as comfortable.
We were tired of all of the areas that we grew up hunting with our families, going to the traditional elk camp that we had all grown up experiencing. We were watching that dissipate because those places, the elk hunters that conventionally would always be there, couldn't find success there. In order to be successful, they had to go hunt just outside of the river bottom or in the farm fields and the alfalfa fields, down on the valley floor where there didn't used to be elk at all until they were run off and down into the valley there by wolf pressure.
Elk have changed their patterns as well. So I think, on that side of the spectrum, we probably need fewer wolves in those areas so that elk can redistribute back into public land. They're not causing so much crop damage and depredation on private land. But to me, it's just one more indicator that, wolves are these lightning rods for kind of everything else. And they're kind of confirmation bias agents, too. They confirm whatever you want to believe. Do we need more wolves? Well, here's examples that you can cite to say, we probably don't have enough wolves in America. Do we have too many wolves? There's an equal number of arguments you can make to say we have too many wolves.
So what comes next? What can we expect from our state and federal governments, and what can hunters expect this fall?
So looking forward kind of in the near term, here in Montana where I live, on August 20th, the state's Fish and Game Commission is going to meet to really put the newly established laws that liberalize wolf hunting to a test. They're basically going to codify them in hunting regulations. That then is going to determine, the rules for the fall hunt, even into the wintertime, and will kind of dictate, how wolves are hunted, how many get hunted. And I think that will be an interesting litmus test for this question of, are states the appropriate managers of wolves, or have states sort of lost their management authority and then to make the argument that they should be turned over to the federal government? So there's really a lot to kind of watch for over the next couple of weeks and then over the next few months.
We literally have never taken the number of wolves that were born in any given season, not one time. The actual numbers, the actual population of wolves has consistently grown every year except the first year that we got a season. And that's because wolves learn so quickly that after that first year, we stopped having the ability to reduce their numbers. I have people that they get frustrated with me and they tell me that I'm wasting my time and my breath by talking to people who have different viewpoints than what I do. My response to that is this. I grew up watching National Geographic videos about wolves exactly the same way they did. The difference is I live where wolves live and they live in the city and they don't understand it. They didn't watch the changes happen. They didn't see it take place. And so those people who have a different viewpoint, who are screaming and yelling and cussing and threatening to kill my kids, they're standing up for what they believe in. And I have to respect them for that. And I try really hard to engage them in educated adult conversations about the topic because it's important. If I didn't live with wolves in my backyard, literally coming down off the hill into my backyard, I would not know any different and I would have their viewpoint.
Reporting for this episode was by our conservation and hunting editor, Andrew McKean. The Outdoor Life podcast is edited and produced by me, Senior Deputy Editor Natalie Krebs. The wolf recordings in this episode were courtesy of the National Park Service and MSU Acoustic Atlas via Jennifer Jarrett and Neil Hebert. News excerpts were from KRE 11, KPAX, KTVB, and the New York Times documentary Wolves at the Door.